The topic for this lecture is about emerging nationalism and revolutions in Southeast Asia, focusing on the Philippines and Indonesia. As you recall, in our previous lectures, we talked about the different colonial transformations that occurred in both mainland and island Southeast Asia during the period of high colonialism. And one of the major impact or effects of colonialism itself was the growth of these nation states and the emergence of nationalist thought. In fact, it is one of the most interesting and perhaps one of the most important topic or theme when understanding modern Southeast Asia. What brought about the rise of nationalism in Southeast Asia? Of course, we cannot divorce this question of nationalism from the question of colonialism itself, because it was during the colonial period where many of the boundaries or the territories of these nation states as we have them now were created. So, if you recall, under colonialism or under colonial governments, colonial boundaries and maps were created. And these colonial boundaries meant fixed borders were established under colonial rule, even by Siam in its effort to define its territories versus colonies contiguous to it. So even in the Kingdom of Siam, where they were not formally colonized by a European power, they still had to define its territory, its map, right? Borders became more than just physical boundaries. They became conceptual boundaries, as in our land, the place where we belong, which meant ethnic and national locations. Aside from the colonial boundaries and maps, colonialism also brought about bureaucratic transformation. High colonialism established large and complex bureaucratic systems, including colonial civil services that greatly expanded in the late 19th and 20th centuries. They all aimed at better control, management, surveillance, which really meant dominance by the Europeans over the indigenous populations of Southeast Asia. Most of these highest offices under the colonial bureaucracies were controlled by white men, usually sent out for a period of time to the colonies. But as bureaucracies grew in size and spread out from colonial capitals into the provinces, they came more and more to rely on indigenous functionaries, increasingly manned, as we know that they were still mostly men who were part of this bureaucracy at the lower and eventually middle levels by native civil servants. In the civil service, you have clerks, secretaries, bookkeepers, all men. In the police forces, armies, local constables, and soldiers, they're all men. Even in companies and business officers, including clerks, foremen, and brokers, all men. And even in the printing presses and newspaper staff, they were all men. Colonial bureaucracies became major arenas for indigenous mobility within the colonial societies. It gave rise to a category of indigenous bureaucratic elites operating under colonial supervisors in civil service, military and police, and private enterprise. So the major area of experience, especially for indigenous peoples, were working within the colonial bureaucracies themselves, right? Here, they learned colonial languages and they enjoyed closer contact with colonial cultures and modern technology. Aside from taking this, what Benedict Anderson called bureaucratic pilgrimage, indigenous peoples also went through the colonial education system. When you talk about education, they were both within the colonial territory themselves or overseas. By the late 19th and into early 20th centuries, the colonial regime set up schools initially to train natives for the colonial bureaucracy. These colonial schools taught colonial languages, history, law, and economics and opened a whole new world to many students. Most of these schools were not intended to provide higher education, but the door was now open, and students from these schools were now eligible to seek further education abroad in the mother country and eventually in colleges established in the colonies themselves. Increasingly in the 20th century, Southeast Asians, mostly from wealthier families or what what many would call the educated elites, but not exclusively, traveled to Europe for more advanced educations, returning with qualifications for higher posts or as medical doctors, engineers, military specialists, etc. These mostly bilingual elites, which we were all versed in colonial and indigenous languages, returned home and started the national movements for independence. So when we think about nationalism, we can think about nationalism both as a political movement, but it was also an intellectual endeavor, right? So when we think about nationalism, it's something that was tangible in the sense that people formed this movements, but it came from first a conception of what nation and independence and national identity really meant, right? And this is really one of the, as I said, most important or significant topic in modern Southeast Asian history is trying to understand what is nationalism, what is it and how did it originate? Why do people die for it? Especially when you think about the 20th century in modern Southeast Asia, you have the burgeoning of all these nationalist movements and the emergence of these nationalist leaders who actually dreamt of independence from colonial rule, right? So nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in modern times. It provides a framework for an interaction with all other peoples. While it remains constant, it has multiple voices and changes its directions over time. It contains positive features because it provides us a sense of belonging to a community. It gives us an identity. What does it mean to be Filipino? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Indonesian, right? So it gives you this commonality with other people. We're occupying the same territories. But at the same time, nationalism contains negative features because it breeds exclusivity and leads us to distrust and hate others. It makes us think that this is who we are and others who are not exactly like us are not us, right? So it makes us very exclusive. It actually led many communities to go to war with others in order and also to conquer others. So nationalism could be both protective because you want to protect your own nation, or it could be aggressive that you want to go to war or occupy other nations in the name of your nation. So one of the foremost thinkers in Southeast Asian political science and history was Benedict Anderson, and he wrote this amazing book called Imagine Communities. And I would encourage everyone to read at least the article on just Imagine Communities of him explaining what he means by nationalism. Because for him, nations or national communities are imagined, that is made up of people who do not know one another and often share very little. They're first imagined by a small group of people, often the national heroes, and are then acted upon, requiring a deep commitment and loyalty from everyone included within the national community, not infrequently requiring people to give their lives in its service. In Southeast Asia, the creation of the nation was spearheaded by educated bilingual elites who conceived what an independent nation should be and then imposed their ideas upon everyone else. These elites discovered and conceived their nation through pilgrimages or journeys within the colonial borders, especially educational and bureaucratic pilgrimages. That's why the creation of bureaucracies and the creation of the education system were so crucial because these elites went through these pilgrimages either through the bureaucracy or through schools, and actually because of their experience and their solidarity with others like them, that they began to imagine a nation that was free from colonial rule. But what was the basis of that? And this is one of the biggest questions, and I want you to also reflect on that. How do you become this? How do you adopt this national identity? Is it based on the fact that you were all occupied the same space? Is it because of the language that you speak? Is it because of religion? Is it because of the government, the system of law, etc.? So these are big questions that I hope that you'll also be able to think about and to reflect on as we think about how this these different colonial territories in Southeast Asia eventually emerge as their own nations, especially in the 20th century. So what were the other influences on Southeast Asian nationalism aside from this pilgrimages that we were talking about, right? So the nation states of Western Europe, of course, had a major influence because they provided models for modern nation states everywhere. Colonial and overseas educations exposed the histories and governments of Europe to Southeast Asian scrutiny. Besides appealing ideas of state formation and social organization, Southeast Asians found models for social and protest movements, for labor organizations, and for political parties. In 1917, especially, one European nation, Russia, provided the classical model of a successful lower class uprising against the dominant class, represented by the Tsar, which was the Bolshevik and the Communist Revolution, which under Lenin captured state power and aggressively began to influence other areas of the world, especially the subjects of colonial rule, on how to organize, resist, and rebel. And basically, because of the Russian Revolution, they were able to get rid of their monarchy, right? And become a much more egalitarian, or at least in thought, the idea of a much more equal society. Communism became a powerful model for many Southeast Asian nationalists because it provided an ideology against colonialism. What other influences, aside from Russia, the Chinese nationalist movement also became an inspiration? The Kuomintang Party under Sun Yat-sen declared its revolution in 1911 against the decaying monarchy and in opposition to Western intervention in China. It sought to destroy the old regime and replace it with a vigorous modern state modeled on republican principles, a state that would restore China's sovereignty and integrity and deal with the West as an equal. The rise of Japan as a world power also influenced Southeast Asian nationalism because was an Asian people who had forged a powerful nation that had mastered the technology of the West and harnessed it for its own industrial and military strength. They had resisted Western colonialism and was by the early 20th century competing with the West for global economic power. In 1904, Japan defeated Russia in a long and ugly land and sea war, or the Russo-Japanese War, and by the 1920s, Japan was a major player in Asia, competing with Europeans and Americans for markets and raw materials and professing a vigorous new ideology of Asia for the Asians, a message tied to Japan's idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a Japan-led economic community that some Southeast Asians found more attractive than European and American colonial rule. As the Pacific War approached, Japan was ready to flex its muscles, just like other major players in the world in Europe, right? And of course, closer to home, there was the Philippine Revolution in 1896, which was seen as the first major anti-colonial revolution in Southeast Asia. The Philippines had provided an example of resistance and revolution against colonialism, which was the 1896 Philippine Revolution against Spain, the first nationalist revolt in Asia, featuring a secret revolutionary society, the Katipunan, or Brotherhood, and the earliest nationalist martyr, Jose Rizal, the Philippines' national hero, who was executed by the Spaniards in December 1896. Though Rizal remembered today and currently being commemorated in Malaysia, as well as the Philippines, the Philippine Revolution and the life and writings of Jose Rizal were not widely known to other Southeast Asians at the time, divided as they were by colonial spheres of influence. So, what were the actual nationalist responses to colonial rule? This is important in order to kind of see that even after hundreds of years of colonial rule, it took so long for this indigenous populations or communities to actually rise up against the colonial power, right? And it took many generations. And also, there were many different forms of resistance in terms of trying to drive out this colonial power, which would eventually occur after World War II. So at first, they would try non-radical forms of resistance, including collaboration and reform. Groups and individuals choosing to work within the colonial structure for change. They believe that they could still change the structure, but they're seeking more conservative ends. Basically, they want to collaborate and work with the colonial governments themselves. This was mostly the way that chosen by wealthier elites, those with more formal colonial educations, those with posts at the higher levels of the colonial bureaucracy or military, those with closer ties to the colonial system, the Christians, long residents in the metropolis, etc. They were chosen by representatives of families who wished to preserve their gains and protect their economic interests. They also were seeking improvements and reforms, more individual rights like constitutions, access to higher posts in bureaucracy, a voice in the colonial government, and colonial citizenship. And of course, the other side of collaboration reform would be the radical forms of resistance, rebellion, and revolution. Groups and individuals who were seeking to drive the colonial rulers out of the country to declare independence. They formed nationalist organizations and parties to realize their goals earlier in the Philippines, starting from the 1860s on, and later elsewhere from the 1910s, 1920s on. They often engage in planning or carrying out rebellions, some lead revolutions. There were more radical groups who adopt a range of ideologies and engage in a number of varying forms of radical resistance. Some also sought the simple overthrow of colonial masters and their replacement by an indigenous government, often undefined or unarticulated, or blind anti colonial rebellion. But others advocated the overthrow of colonial masters and their replacement by various republican forms of government, usually based on elections and varieties of democratic processes, not necessarily egalitarian in intent, but often more indirect systems that would favor elite domination over the larger population. Nationalist revolution devoid of social content, with indigenous elites replacing colonial rulers. Still, others sought much more. Others sought and were attracted by the socialist and the communist ideology and revolution that entailed the overthrow of the colonial masters. Not only that, but a complete restructuring of the indigenous society according to socialist ideas. These are nationalist and social revolutions in opposition to colonial rule and the capitalist system. Now let's talk about the Philippines. So the Philippine Revolution against Spain, as I said, started in probably in the mid 19th century, just in terms of the formation of all these nationalist ideas. But then it culminated in the 1890s. So the Philippine Revolution against Spain was spearheaded by this organization called the Katipunan, meaning the Brotherhood, or a revolutionary organization, which launched a revolt against the Spanish colonial government in August 1896. In retaliation, the Spanish executed nationalist Jose Rizal in December 1896, whose death further strengthened revolutionary sentiments. Who was Jose Rizal? Jose Rizal was actually one of the leaders who started as a reformer who worked to actually collaborate with the Spanish government or thought about reforming the Spanish government in that sense. Um, or their relationship in the Philippines, right? So he was a writer, he was an intellectual, and he actually studied also in Europe, and because of his experiences in Europe, became much more determined in terms of understanding these nationalist ideals. He wrote two very influential books called Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, which were scathing indictments of the Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines. And because of this, the Spanish labeled him as a subversive. So when the revolution happened in August 1896, they blamed Rizal himself of fomenting the revolution, even though at that point he was already in exile in Mindanao and was not very involved with political organizations, right? But because of this move, it actually, as I said, further strengthened revolutionary sentiments of the Filipinos. So the Spanish retained its control in the Philippines because the revolution failed by signing a truce with the Katipunas, whose leaders were then sent into exile. But with the help of the Americans who were embroiled in a war against Spain in the Spanish American War, revolutionary leaders in exile returned to the Philippines and declared the Philippine independence on June 12, 1898. It was an independence that will not be recognized by the Americans, and this is something that we will talk about later on. So, what were the important events in understanding the Philippine Revolution against Spain? So, it happened in August 29, which was the Katipunan Revolt, which was a failure. But what happened was the Spanish then put Jose Rizal, the nationalist thinker and intellectual, on trial, on a mock trial, and at the end executed him on December 30, 1896. But the the Katipunan leaders then went into exile, but in the end went back to the Philippines and declared the Philippine independence, all within this context of the Spanish American War and the Philippine American War, which will be our topic later. So this is the Katipunan meant kataas-taasang kagalang-galangan, katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan, or the supreme and venerable society and brotherhood of the sons of the people. So Andres Bonifacio was founded the Katipunan. He was a big admirer of Jose Rizal. He actually joined Jose Rizal's own organization before Rizal went into exile. But he believed, unlike Rizal, that reforms were futile under the Spanish and believed that revolution was the only solution towards independence. And so he then formed the revolutionary organization, the Katipunan, in 1892. This is Jose Rizal, who was executed, and this was photo of his execution in what is now known as Rizal Park. These were the revolutionaries fighting against Spain, some of their images. And the most successful revolutionary leader or general was Emilio Aguinaldo. He was the general of the Katipunan who led the victorious battles against the Spanish, and he was the one who eventually made a deal with the Spanish when the revolution was not successful. He went into exile, but then went back to the Philippines with the help of the Americans and declared Philippine independence and became the first president of the Republic of the Philippines. And this is the proclamation of the independence. So you can see that as early as the 19th century, I mean, it's up to you to think whether it's as early or not, because that came after 300 years of colonial rule, but it was the first nationalist revolt in Southeast Asia, right? So in a way, it was pioneering in that sense, right? So this was with the first nationalist revolt and the Declaration of Independence in 1898. This is the Philippine flag. So aside from the Philippines, Indonesia also had a lot of major movements, wars, and rebellions in the 19th and 20th centuries. First of all was the Java War, which was fought from 1825 to 1830 under the leadership of a young charismatic Javanese prince, Diponegoro of Yogyakarta. A major rebellion broke out against the Dutch in 1825, which was joined by large numbers of priyayi, or nobles or elites. The wars lasted for 5 years until the Dutch finally defeated the rebel armies and obtained the surrender of Diponegoro in 1830. Though the rebels were punished severely, the Dutch realized the need to secure the support of indigenous elites at the local and district levels. The Dutch therefore continued to rule Java through the Priyayi, leaving these aristocrats in place and gradually incorporating them into the emerging colonial administration of the late 19th century. So this is almost like what the Spanish did when the Filipinos had the revolution, right? They struck a deal with the government itself. So this is what the Dutch did. So this is an image of Pangeran Diponegoro of the war, the Dutch war, and this is again an image of him surrendering or being captured by the Dutch. But this one of the reforms that the Dutch did after the war was to to actually encourage an ethical movement. Colonial reformers called for changes in colonial policies and for new institutions to care for the needs of these people. There was much criticism of the cultivation system as root cause for the impoverishment of Javanese peasants. Among the ethical critics of colonial rule were leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church, many of whom had established themselves as missionaries throughout the colony. At the start of the 1900s, the Dutch colonial government responded and began to institute a series of reforms that have been called the ethical policy. Among the reforms were efforts to institute social welfare activities that would assist peasants and laborers, to implement increased health measures at the local level, and to expand the colonial education system. Dutch language schools were set up all over the archipelago and especially in Java, at first training bureaucrats but later attracting bright students all over the archipelago to begin their study of a wide range of topics. Natives also began to learn Indonesian since Indonesian was rapidly becoming an important second language. So you can see when in terms of understanding the rise of nationalism in Indonesia that they had different forms of fighting for the nation, right? So they had reformers, reform movements like the ethical movement. And of course, there were wars and revolutions like the Java War, for example. And then also the formation of organizations or movements like Sarekat Islam, which was a form of Islamic anti-colonialism movement. Islam had been an arena of life outside Dutch scrutiny or direct involvement, leading many Islamic leaders to channel their early anti colonial and national sentiments through Islamic ideas and movements. Sarakat Islam, meaning Islamic Union, was the most prominent of these movements. It was founded in 1912, lasted until 1926. Sarakat Islam attracted a large and diverse following, including in addition to Islamic leaders, Javanese businessmen, workers, and urban intellectuals. Between 1916 and 1919, Sarkat Islam moved toward a form of radicalism that brought Dutch repression down upon it. After a series of relatively small and isolated rebellions in 1919, many of Sarkat Islam's leaders and members were arrested, some imprisoned, others were exiled. Though the movement itself survived for another decade, it lost most of its more active and radical leaders to other more focused political parties that subsequently operated less publicly but always in fear of Dutch repression. So it was a form of radicalism, the formation of Islamic anti-colonialism or Sarakat Islam, right? And they were able, since Indonesia was still majority a Muslim population, they were able to attract a lot of followers. But unfortunately, this movement also was not successful, which then led to a much more organized challenge to Dutch rule, which was the communist challenge by the PKI or the Partai Komunis Indonesia. Socialists and communists had been active in Sarakat Islam from the start. As the Dutch began to crack down on Sarakat Islam, the socialist and communist members of the organization moved to establish their own clandestine party. By 1920, these men formed the Communist Party of the Indies, which in 1924 was changed to PKI, adopting the term Indonesia rather than Indies to refer to the new imagined community it represented. From the outset, the PKI was political and radical, seeking the rapid transformation of colonial society. As such, most of its leaders were jailed or exiled by 1925. Building upon their association with Sarkat Islam and with Sarkat Islam mass followings in the countryside, the PKI went into rebellion in late 1926 and early 1927. This rebellion was a great disaster for the PKI and remnants of Sarkat Islam as the Dutch crushed their forces everywhere by January 1927, arresting 13,000 people, executing some, and placing 4,500 in prison. The PKI was dead at this point and did not revive for nearly 20 years. So this lecture was really about the rise of nationalism and how finally, after how many years of colonial rule, the indigenous peoples and were able to articulate an ideology of anti-colonialism and freedom from colonial rule. Even if I said finally, it doesn't mean that that they actually just endured this colonial rule for centuries. As we've already understood, colonialism itself is so impenetrable and it's so powerful and it seeps through every aspect of life in colonial society, making it virtually impossible for indigenous societies to respond and resist to the impositions of this colonial rule, right? So it really took a powerful ideology like nationalism, which then translated into movements, right? That eventually led to a wellspring of ideas and for reform and revolution, which went eventually then lead to the formation of nation states in Southeast Asia.